Our next storyteller is Lynn Brotman. Lynn is an interior designer who grew up in Dallas, Texas. She says she's happiest when she's with her two sons, and now even especially when she's with her first grandchild, who's a little girl, Hannah Ruth, who's named after Lynn's mother. When I asked Lynn my pre-Passover question about where she would escape to get away from these freezing temperatures and the oppression of shoveling, she said, the real answer is anywhere my sons are. But for this, I know, isn't that nice? But for this exercise, I'm saying we're all in Hawaii. Why not taking a kayak trip to the falls? And why not, indeed, because it was a hypothetical question. So you can be with your family in Hawaii. Please welcome Lynn Brotman. Okay, you good with the mic? That looks right to me.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you like it?
Yeah.
Make it look really.
Okay. Hi. That's it, right? Whew. On my 18th birthday, I'm sitting on my bed in my dormitory room at the University of Texas in Austin without a care in the world. Gosh, I'm 18, I'm thinking about how I'm going to go out and celebrate with my friends, parties during the day, parties at night. I didn't have a care in the world. But before I could start these celebrations, I had to wait for that scheduled phone call from my mother. Do y'all remember what that was like before cell phones? You had to schedule a time to talk to your parents, and you had better be in that dormitory room when they called. So the loving mother, of course, that I had called me and gave me all the beautiful wishes that one gives to her favorite child, although I am the baby, so. And giving me these beautiful birthday wishes. And in her soft, I always thought, sweet German accent, she ended the phone call with, but remember, you must register to vote. It is your right and it's your responsibility. When my mother was 18, she was put on a ship to the United States. She didn't want to go. She cried the entire way. She didn't know a soul, but she knew what her responsibility was. And her responsibility was to get affidavits of sponsorship and finances to bring over the rest of her family. It was her father, her mother, and her sister. Well, she did know a distant cousin who gave her sponsorship. And she did know a boyfriend who had left from Frankfurt a year and a half early, but had since found another young woman in the meantime. She knew what her responsibilities were at 18, and she was burdened with them. But my mother never thought of herself as a Holocaust survivor. She had survivor's guilt. I think it's because she wasn't there when the Nazis came to her home in Frankfurt and wasn't with her sister when her sister was put between the mattresses to hide from the Nazis, or when her father pretended like he was an old, decrepit man so the Nazis wouldn't bother with him. She rarely talked about, here she was, a young woman, 18 years old, in a foreign country, barely knowing the language, considered an enemy alien, and she worked in a factory. She was a seamstress in a factory, and she worked all day. And then at night, she spent the entire night going through the phone book, looking for any names that could possibly be names that she remembered from her parents talking about, I think we know this, I think we know this relative, or maybe there's this relative. So she could connect with them to get sponsorship to bring her family over. She also, interestingly enough, I didn't find out until she was much older and was doing an interview, that when she did get these papers together and had to go in front of a congressman to get his final approval, she described it as being so humiliating and had to beg to save her family. My mom tells about how she remembers her father crying only twice. When she was 14, she remembers her father coming up the stairs to their apartment in Frankfurt and sitting down the living room chair and putting his head in his hands and beginning to cry. And of course, his wife and his 2 daughters came up to him and was concerned, "What is it?" And he said, "I saw it. I saw the proclamation. The Nazis have issued a proclamation that Jews could no longer vote." And he began to cry. And as my mother described it, bitterly. He cried bitterly. And the second time she remembers her father crying was when he put her on that train in Frankfurt to go to Calais, where she caught that freighter that carried a few passengers and sent her off. And that was the last memory my mother had of seeing her father alive, although she was reunited with her sister and her mother. When I was a young girl in Dallas, I have a memory of a very strong, quiet mother who took me with her every time she went to vote. I remember the whole experience so well. And she also took me when she spoke to local politicians. If you can remember, it's hard to even imagine, but in Texas at that time, there still was a poll tax. The rest of the country had kind of moved on. But in Texas, there was probably about 1 of 3 or 4 states that still had a poll tax, which actually means you had to pay to vote. Well, that just pulled at my mother's heartstrings tremendously. It was obviously a blatant act of bigotry. And so for the second time, my mother found herself speaking to congressmen about basic democratic human rights, that this poll tax needed to be repealed. So I have never missed an opportunity to vote. And every time I go to a voting booth and pull that lever and the cord wraps around, the curtain wraps around, or I have my ballot and I slip it into the ballot box, I think of my mother and I think of my grandfather, and that it is my right and my responsibility to vote. Thank you.
Great job, Lynn. That's a really awesome legacy from your mother and your new baby granddaughter who's over there sleeping. She's 14 weeks. I bet you'll take her to vote, and yeah, fabulous.